My name is Olivia. I am 22, and I used to believe embarrassment was just the price of living under someone else's roof. That belief shattered on my dad's 60th birthday in our own backyard, with 35 people watching and smiling like they were waiting for a punchline. I had been up since 5 that morning, following a long list of chores I did not write, but somehow always owned. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. The lights at the Napa Valley estate were blinding, a sharp contrast to the cold calculation beginning to form behind my eyes. Jeffrey, the man I had called father for 19 years, stood at the center of the terrace, his tuxedo crisp and his ego even crisper. This was his $100 million moment, the innovation gala that was supposed to cement his legacy in Silicon Valley. I was just the help, the intern who worked 80 hours a week for the privilege of a room in the basement and the scraps of his approval. I stepped onto the stage. The small biocell prototype I had built from my mother's hidden journals tucked into my palm. I built it from my mother's journals, which she had hidden inside the hollowed-out floorboards of the basement pantry, the only place Jeffrey never bothered to look because he deemed it beneath his notice. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to recognize that I was not just a burden. I was the one who had solved the protein binding problem that had stalled his company for a year. I placed the device in his hand, my heart pounding a rhythm of desperate hope. He did not smile. He did not even look at the telemetry on the screen. He held the biocell between 2 fingers as if it were a used tissue. "What worthless junk is this?" he shouted, his voice booming across the garden, silencing 300 elite guests. I opened my mouth to tell him about the 24% efficiency increase, but the air was ripped out of my lungs. His palm struck my cheek with the force of a tectonic shift. The sound of his hand hitting my face cracked through the speakers like a gunshot. The room didn't laugh. It went deathly silent. Cell phones were raised, recording the downfall of a tech giant's dignity, while his perfect guests gasped in horror. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my sister Destiny, her phone held high, the red live light blinking as she streamed my humiliation to her 200,000 followers. To them, I was not a daughter. I was content. I was a failed experiment to be mocked in the comment section. I did not cry. Crying was a liability I could no longer afford. I did not beg for an apology, because my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. This was not a family crisis. It was an accounting error, and it was time to balance the books. I turned and walked away, my steps quiet on the stone path. I did not go to the basement to pack my clothes. I went to the server room, the one Jeffrey never entered because he did not actually understand the technology he sold. I sat at the terminal, my fingers moving with a precision that was clinical, almost lethal. The Beta 1 project, the centerpiece of his pitch tomorrow, was protected by a triple-layer encryption key I had written myself. Jeffrey was so arrogant, he even made me set up his private cloud servers, thinking I was too submissive to ever look at the files I was organizing. He thought he owned it because he owned the building. He was wrong. I entered the administrative bypass code. I didn't just delete his files. I triggered an encrypted dead man's switch that leaked his fraudulent tax records and stolen patents directly to the SEC and the Patent Office. By the time he realized his servers were wiped, the federal authorities already had enough to freeze every single one of his assets. By 12:03 a.m., the retaliation was complete. Upstairs, the Gala music was still playing, the violins screaming into the night. Jeffrey was still being toasted by billionaires, unaware that his empire was now a collection of empty folders and unrecoverable data. I grabbed my backpack, filled with nothing but my mother's original notes, and walked out of the Napa estate into the rain. I was leaving the Langford name behind, and I was not taking the burden of their expectations with me. For 19 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I had paid my dues in sweat, silence, and the total erasure of my own identity. Love was never a gift in that house. It was a high-interest loan I could never fully repay. Every meal, every roof over my head, and every piece of secondhand clothing was recorded in a ledger Jeffrey kept in his mind. He called it gratitude. I called it a domestic internship that I never applied for. I had lived in Jeffrey's shadow for 19 years, but for the last decade, I had been his ghost intern, a captive mind working 80 hours a week since I was 12. I was not just managing the household. I was the ghost in the machine of Langford Tech. I scrubbed laboratory equipment, organized thousands of data points, and refined logistics for shipments I was told I was too unstable to understand. My compensation was the privilege of staying in a room in the basement that smelled like laundry detergent and dust. The disparity was a constant, blinding light. While I was hiding tip money in my shoe just to afford basic school supplies, my sister Destiny lived in a different reality. She received a $200,000 monthly allowance, a sum she blew on designer handbags and clout-chasing trips that she broadcast to the world. She was the face of the family. I was the tax-deductible labor. People often ask why survivors of situations like mine do not just leave the moment things get bad. They do not understand the invisible chains Jeffrey had forged around my mind. It was a psychological prison without bars. Every time I reached for the door, he would remind me that he had rescued me. He made me believe that without him, I was nothing but the worthless junk he called my mother's notes. This is what psychological experts call a prison of false gratitude. You are conditioned to believe you owe your life to the person who is slowly draining it from you. Your sense of self becomes a balance sheet they alone have the power to audit. I lived in a constant state of survival mode, where my only goal was to minimize the explosions that Jeffrey used to keep me small. I stayed because I had been taught that the outside world was cold, but the house was safe. I did not realize until that night that the coldness was coming from inside the house. I had been footing the bill for a subscription to a family that never wanted me, but as I walked through the Napa rain, that balance sheet finally made sense. I did not owe them my gratitude. They owed me for 4 years of stolen labor and 19 years of psychological warfare. I looked back at the glowing windows of the estate, and for the first time, I did not see a home. I saw a corporate entity that was about to go bankrupt. My compassion was a resource they had overdrafted for the last time. The account was closed. Jeffrey did not wait for the sun to rise to start his counterattack. By 4 a.m, my phone began vibrating with a rhythm that was frantic and desperate. I did not answer a single call. I sat in a 24-hour diner, the glow of my laptop screen casting a cold light on my face, watching the digital fire I had started. He had discovered the wipe, and I could almost hear his scream echoing all the way from the Napa estate. But instead of an apology, Jeffrey chose escalation. He did not just text me. He went for my future. He posted a public notice on LinkedIn and tagged the major venture capital boards and Silicon Valley tech forums. In his version of the story, I was not his daughter. I was an unstable former intern with a history of schizophrenic episodes who had stolen proprietary trade secrets. He painted me as a liability, a troubled girl who had bitten the hand that fed her. It was a calculated, professional execution of my reputation. "Return the encryption keys now, or you will never work in this valley again," he texted me at 5:07 a.m. "You are officially blacklisted, Olivia. You have nothing without the Langford name." I did not cry. I did not ask why he was doing this, because I already knew the answer. I was no longer useful, so I had to be destroyed. I looked at the screen and felt a sharp clinical sense of clarity. This was not a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. He thought he was burying me, but he was actually just documenting his own motive. Every threat, every lie, and every public smear was another entry in the ledger I was preparing to hand to a judge. Jeffrey believed his status made him untouchable. He thought a few paragraphs of corporate jargon could erase the 19 years of labor I had given him. He was not shocked by what he had done. He was shocked that I had stopped playing along. He was used to me being his silent investor, the ghost in his machine who accepted shaming as the price of survival. Now, he was facing an auditor who knew exactly how hollow his empire really was. The digital smokescreen he was creating was meant to hide the fact that his $100 million Series B pitch was now a collection of empty folders. He was trying to blacklist me to keep me silent, but silence was a currency I had stopped using. I closed my laptop and stepped out of the diner into the gray morning light. Inside my mind, my reality glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet, lethal retribution. I was walking toward the train station, the cold Napa rain soaking through my thin hoodie, when a midnight blue luxury electric sedan drifted silently to the curb beside me. My instinct was to run to vanish into the shadows of the roadside oaks, but the car didn't lunge. It just sat there, humming with a quiet power that seemed to vibrate in the very air I was breathing. A man stepped out from the passenger side. He was in his 50s, wearing a charcoal wool coat that whispered of quiet wealth. Beside him stood a man I recognized from the periphery of the tech world, Daniel, a high-stakes litigation attorney known for dismantling corporate empires. "Olivia," the older man said, his voice cracking as it hit the cold night air. "Please, just 1 minute." I gripped the straps of my backpack, the physical weight of my mother's journals pressing against my spine. "How do you know that name?" "To everyone else, I'm just Maddie." Jeffrey made sure of that. "Because Maddie was a name he invented to keep you hidden," he said, stepping into the sickly yellow light of a street lamp. He looked exhausted, his face etched with deep worry lines, but there was a light in his eyes I had never seen in any man's gaze before. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out an old photograph, holding it out with hands that trembled with a lifetime of suppressed emotion. I took the paper, my fingers numb. It was an old print, slightly frayed at the edges. A young woman stood in a field, laughing. Beside her was a tall man with his arm draped protectively over her shoulders. And in her arms was a baby wrapped in a soft, white blanket, a baby with dark hair and a distinctly crooked left eyebrow. I looked at the man standing before me, then back at the photo. The brow was his, the jaw was mine. "My name is Jonathan," he said quietly. "I was Jeffrey's lab partner 19 years ago. After the car accident that took your mother, I wasn't just injured, I was in a coma for nearly 4 years. The air in my lungs turned to ice. Jeffrey told me you were dead. He told me I was a burden he carried because he was a hero. He didn't rescue you, Olivia. He stole you." Daniel, the attorney, interjected his voice as precise as a surgeon's blade. "He forged Jonathan's signature on the relinquishment papers while he was hooked up to a ventilator. He didn't want a child. He wanted the legal rights to your mother's research patents, the technology you've been perfecting in that basement." I looked at Jonathan, seeing the 19 years of grief in his eyes and the search that had never yielded until this very moment. He wasn't a stranger. He was the person I was supposed to be. "I've been fighting through a mountain of forged paperwork since the day I woke up," Jonathan whispered. "But Jeffrey used his influence to bury your existence, changing your name and records until the trail went cold. I finally understood why Jonathan's investigators could never find me. Jeffrey hadn't just changed my name to Maddie, he had assigned me the social security number of a child who had passed away decades ago. On paper, Olivia Whitman was dead, and Maddie Langford didn't legally exist. I was a digital ghost, hidden in plain sight behind a wall of forged documents and corporate shells." Then he said the 5 words that made my entire world tilt. "I am your biological father." The subscription to the Langford family wasn't just canceled, it was a fraud. I wasn't an intern, I wasn't junk, I was a stolen legacy. "We have the proof," Olivia Daniels said, holding open the door to the silent sedan. "And it's time to settle the account." Jeffrey lunged forward, his face contorted in rage, but Daniel stepped between us with the practiced calm of a man who had seen 1,000 boardrooms fall. "Don't make this a criminal assault charge, Jeffrey," Daniel whispered. "We're leaving?" Jonathan's private medical team arrived at the hotel suite within the hour, discreetly collecting the samples needed to confirm what his heart already knew. I sat in the sterile, white-tucked silence of the hotel room, watching Daniel spread a series of forensic audits across the mahogany desk. He didn't speak in metaphors about family or betrayal. He spoke in figures, and the figures were devastating. For 19 years, I had believed I was a burden Jeffrey Langford carried out of the goodness of his heart. I realize now that I was actually a high-yield investment with no overhead costs. Daniel pointed to a state ledger from a decade ago. "Jeffrey didn't just forge your adoption, Olivia, he monetized it. He listed you as a high-needs dependent with significant neurological impairment. He collected state subsidies for your specialized care every month while you were scrubbing his floors and writing his proprietary code in the basement. Jeffrey didn't just steal my work, he stole from the state in my name. For 19 years, he used a private, corrupt doctor to file false medical reports, claiming I suffered from severe cognitive impairment. He kept me isolated at the estate so no social worker could ever verify his lies. I was a ghost intern, funded by the very government he was defrauding. I scanned the yearly totals, my vision sharpening with every line. There were educational grants for disadvantaged youth that I never saw, medical stipends for dental work I was never allowed to have, and federal tax credits for a troubled ward that Jeffrey claimed year after year. He had funneled the money through a web of shell companies to pay for Destiny's social media managers, and the very gala where he had slapped me. I did the math in my head, the numbers clicking into place like the tumblers of a safe, total amount embezzled through my identity, $435,000. My life hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a tax shield. Every explosion of his temper and every moment he spent reminding me of my worthlessness was a calculated tactic to keep the profit center from asking for an audit. "This is the kill shot," Daniel said, his voice as cold as the data on the screen. "We have the forensic signatures and the bank transfers linked directly to his personal accounts. This isn't a family dispute anymore, Olivia. It's a systematic fraud against the state and a federal felony." I looked at Jonathan, who was watching me with a mixture of grief and a burgeoning, protective fury. He wasn't the man Jeffrey had told me was dead. He was the man who had been erased because his existence was a liability to Jeffrey's profit margins. The realization didn't make me want to cry. It made me want to balance the books. Jeffrey thought he had blacklisted me from the valley, but he didn't realize that I was the only person who knew where the bodies were buried in his server racks. We spent the next 6 hours preparing the final dossier, not a story of a hurt daughter, but a clinical report of a criminal enterprise. Jeffrey's Series B pitch was scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. He was expecting a $100 million infusion of capital. Instead, he was going to get a total liquidation of his character. The Langford Tech boardroom was a temple of glass and steel overlooking the valley Jeffrey believed he had conquered. Through the heavy oak doors, I could hear his voice, that practiced booming baritone he used to sedate investors and terrify me. He was halfway through his pitch for the $100 million Series B round, spinning a tale of innovation and family values that had built his empire. He was showing them a slide of the biocell prototype, the same one he had called worthless junk less than 24 hours ago. I did not knock. I did not ask for permission. I pushed the doors open, my footsteps echoing with a clinical finality that silenced the room. Beside me, Jonathan and Daniel walked with the weight of 19 years of suppressed truth. Jeffrey stopped mid-sentence, his face a mask of professionally curated confusion that quickly sharpened into a sneer. He opened his mouth to bark an order to call me Maddie and have security remove the unstable intern, but I was faster. I did not scream. I did not make a scene. I reached for the central console and connected my mother's journals to the room's digital hub. "Before you sign those term sheets," I said, my voice devoid of the fear he had spent 2 decades cultivating, "you should hear the CEO's honest assessment of the technology you're buying." I hit play. The audio from the Gala filled the room, Jeffrey's voice, distorted by rage, shouting, "What worthless junk is this?" followed by the wet, sickening crack of his hand hitting my face. The board members shifted, their expressions turning from interest to visceral disgust. The hero of Silicon Valley was revealed as a common thug in a tuxedo. But I was not finished. Daniel stepped forward and placed the binder on the table, the DNA results showing a 99.999% match to Jonathan and the ledger documenting the $435,000 Jeffrey had embezzled through my identity. This adoption was a fraud, I told the room. And this company is a tax shelter built on stolen patents and criminal embezzlement. The silence that followed was absolute. One by one, the investors stood up. They did not look at Jeffrey. They looked through him, as if he had already become a ghost. The $100 million deal evaporated before the ink could even touch the paper. As the doors closed behind the last board member, Jeffrey's mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He did not look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like a hollow shell. He sank into his leather chair, his hands shaking as he reached for me, begging me to save the company's reputation. I realized then the truth about people like Jeffrey. His power was not a part of who he was, it was an accessory he had bought with other people's lives. This is the illusion of power held by an empty wallet. When the money vanishes, the character underneath is revealed as nothing but dust. He had built his identity on having status rather than being a man of substance. Now that the status was liquidated, there was nothing left to hold him upright. "The experiment is over, Jeffrey," I said, looking at the man who had erased my name to fill his bank account. "Your balance is 0. Jeffrey faced the full weight of the legal system, indicted for multi-state fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Langford Tech did not survive the scandal. It was liquidated within months, its board members scattering to distance themselves from his toxic shadow. I received $435,000 in restitution, a sum that represented every cent he had stolen from my care and education over 19 years. I did not use that money for a lifestyle he taught me to crave. I used it to plant a seed. I established the Whitman Legacy Foundation. We do not just provide financial aid, we provide legal protection for young researchers and students coming from the foster system or abusive households, People who have brilliant ideas but no voice to defend them. This is what I call the justice of the sower. The world often focuses on the justice of punishment, watching the villain fall and lose everything. And while seeing Jeffrey in a courtroom was necessary, it was only half the victory. Real justice is taking the ashes of a destroyed past and using them to fertilize the future for someone else. By helping others protect their intellectual property, I turned Jeffrey's greed into a catalyst for innovation that he can no longer control. With Jonathan's legal team helping me reclaim the royalties from my stolen patents, I finally had a bank account that bore my real name. I now live in a small, sun-drenched apartment in Palo Alto. From my balcony, I can see the distant Napa hills, but they don't look like a prison anymore. They are just land. For the first time in my life, I am not Maddie, the failed experiment. I am Olivia Whitman. I have come to realize that blood gives you a name, but character gives you a legacy. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that your silence is often the only thing keeping their empire standing. The moment you decide you are worth more than the role they assigned you is the moment you become free. Forgiveness is not always for the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free from the balance sheet of their expectations. If you have ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, you are not alone. I want you to hear me clearly. You are not a payment. You are not a tax shield. You are not an inconvenience. You deserve a life that belongs entirely to you. Tell me in the comments the name you want to be known by and one boundary you are finally ready to set today to protect your peace. If this story resonated with you, please hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to join our community. We value character over status here.